I want you to forget every study tip you've ever been given. Seriously, just put it all aside for the next few minutes because most of it was built on the wrong assumption that studying more is the answer. More hours, more notes, more highlighters. And if you've ever put in real hours before an exam and still walked out feeling like you barely knew the material, you already know that more isn't the answer. The method is, and the method most people are using is wrong in a very specific, very fixable way. What I'm going to share with you are 5 techniques built on decades of real research into how memory actually works, something you can use tonight. Number 1, elaborative interrogation. Most students read a fact and move on. The brain registers it, it feels familiar for a while, and then it fades. Elaborative interrogation is a technique that stops that from happening, and it's one of the most consistently supported methods in cognitive psychology research. The technique is simple in description and surprisingly difficult in practice. Every time you encounter a fact or a concept while studying, you ask one question: why is this true? Why does this work this way? Why did this historical event unfold in this sequence? Why does this formula produce this result? The act of generating an explanation for why something is true, rather than just accepting that it is, forces a depth of processing that passive reading never reaches. John Dunlosky at Kent State University reviewed hundreds of learning studies and ranked elaborative interrogation as one of the highest utility techniques available to students. The reason it works is that the brain stores information in networks, each piece of knowledge connected to other pieces. When you ask why, you're forced to connect the new information to things you already understand. And connected information is dramatically more retrievable than isolated information. The fact that sits alone in your memory is the first thing you forget. The fact that's woven into a web of explanations is the one that stays. The practice is straightforward. As you read, every time you encounter something important, stop and write a brief explanation of why it's true in your own words before moving on. Where you can't generate the explanation, that's where you go back to the material and dig deeper. The gaps in your why explanations are the gaps in your actual understanding. Number 2, concrete examples. Abstract concepts are the hardest things to retain because the brain has nothing to anchor them to. You can read a definition 10 times and still struggle to reproduce it under pressure because abstract language doesn't naturally connect to anything concrete in your existing memory. The technique that fixes this is generating your own concrete examples for every abstract concept you encounter. This sounds simple because it is, but there's a crucial distinction between using the examples provided in your textbook and generating your own. The research, documented by cognitive psychologists including Micheline Chi at Arizona State University, shows that self-generated examples produce significantly stronger retention than examples provided externally. When you create the example yourself, you're forced to understand the concept well enough to apply it, which is a much higher cognitive operation than recognizing an example someone else created. The practice is this: after encountering any abstract concept, close the material and generate 2 examples of your own, one from your own life or experience, one from the real world. If you're studying a psychological principle, find an example of it in a relationship you've had. If you're studying an economic concept, find an example of it in a business you know. The more personal and specific the example, the more strongly it will anchor the concept in your memory. And when the exam arrives, you won't be trying to recall the definition, you'll recall the example, and the definition will follow from it naturally. Number 3, the Cornell method. The Cornell note-taking system was developed at Cornell University in the 1950s by Walter Paulk and has been referenced in academic literature ever since, but almost nobody uses it the way it was actually designed to be used, which is why most people who try it don't get the results it's capable of producing. The basic structure divides your note page into 3 sections: a narrow column on the left for cues and questions, a wider column on the right for your actual notes during the lecture or reading, and a summary section at the bottom of the page. During the session, you take notes in the right column as normal. Immediately after, and this is the step most people skip, you go back through those notes and write questions in the left column that the notes answer. The summary section gets filled with a 2 or 3 sentence synthesis of the entire page in your own words. The reason this system works is what happens when you return to the material for review. You cover the right column, leaving only the questions visible, and you use those questions to test your recall before checking your notes. Every review session becomes a retrieval practice session automatically built into the structure of your notes. You're not just rereading, you're being tested gap by gap on everything you covered. And the summary at the bottom forces you to synthesize the material at the conceptual level rather than just a detail level, which is what exam questions almost always test. The key is doing the cue column immediately after the session while the material is still fresh enough to know which questions matter. Leave it for a day and the system loses most of its power. Number 4, distributed practice with increasing intervals. This technique builds on the concept of spaced repetition but takes it further in a specific direction that most discussions of spacing don't address. The research from Hal Pashler at UC San Diego on optimal spacing intervals shows that the gap between study sessions should increase progressively rather than staying fixed, and that the optimal gap is related to how far away the test is. Here's what this means practically. If your exam is a week away, your ideal review gaps are roughly 1 day, then 2 days, then 4 days. If your exam is a month away, the gaps can be longer, 3 days, then a week, then 2 weeks. The principle is that each review should happen just before you would have forgotten the material, early enough that some memory trace still exists, late enough that retrieving it requires genuine effort. That effort is what deepens the encoding each time. Most students either review too soon, when the material is still fresh and the retrieval is too easy to produce a strong memory effect, or too late, after they've essentially forgotten it and have to relearn rather than strengthen. The increasing interval approach keeps you in the productive zone, always retrieving with just enough difficulty to make the memory stronger without making it so hard that you're starting from scratch. The practical setup is simple. When you finish studying a topic for the first time, write the review dates in your calendar before you close the book. Make the decision when you're clear-headed, not on the day of the review when the temptation is to skip it. The schedule removes the willpower question from the equation entirely. Number 5, dual coding, using 2 memory systems instead of 1. Your brain has multiple memory systems that can work simultaneously, and dual coding is the technique that deliberately activates more than one of them for the same information. The concept was developed by Alan Pavio at the University of Western Ontario and has been replicated across decades of research. The core finding is that information encoded both verbally and visually is remembered significantly better than information encoded in only one format. In practice, this means translating your written notes into visual representations, diagrams, timelines, concept maps, sketches, not as a replacement for the written material, but as an addition to it. The visual isn't a summary. It's a second encoding of the same information in a different format, activating a different memory system, creating a second retrieval pathway to the same knowledge. The power of this technique becomes clear during exams. When you try to retrieve something encoded only verbally, you have one pathway to it. When you encoded it both verbally and visually, you have 2. If the verbal recall fails under pressure, the visual often surfaces first and you remember what the diagram looked like and the information comes with it. Students who use dual coding report a different quality of memory under exam conditions, less blanking, more complete recall, and a greater sense of being able to reconstruct answers even when they can't remember every detail verbatim. The technique works best when you create the visual yourself rather than copying one from a textbook. Because the act of constructing the visual forces the same depth of processing as elaborative interrogation, you have to understand the relationships between concepts well enough to represent them spatially, which is a higher cognitive operation than simply reading about them. So that's all for today. I hope you learned something new. If you did, share your thoughts with us in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.